Hello, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Sam Yamoah, SVP, Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer here at Cambia Health Solution. Welcome to the first virtual event by Region Health Policy Center. Very excited to facilitate this topic on improving drug affordability, the promise of biosimilars. Just want to highlight the Region's Health Policy Center is focused on bringing forward policy discussion topics and solutions to elevate and educate all stakeholders in the healthcare ecosystem to continue to drive affordability, accessibility for our members. The conversation today will be pulling on experts in the biosimilar space to bring a much needed attention to specialty drugs. If most of you know, specialty drugs continue to rise year over year at an alarming rate. And so making sure that as health insurers, we can provide affordability and accessibility when it comes to our members is a very important piece. During today's discussion, I encourage you to submit through the chat Q&A functionality questions that you have top of mind or would like to hear from our esteemed panelists. Today, I would love to welcome three esteemed guests that are very knowledgeable in this space. Kate Lockhart is Executive Director of Biologics and Biosimilars Collective Intelligence Consortium. Kate, welcome. Next is Lee Purvis, who is the Director of Healthcare Costs and Access in AARP's Public Policy Institute. Lee, welcome. And finally, David Robertson, who is our Vice President of Clinical Pharmacy here at Regents Blue Cross Blue Shield. David, welcome. Thanks, all three of you, for joining us today. Really glad to have you with us. And for everyone joining, our moderator in the background who are making sure all the logistics working will be putting detailed information on bios for our panelists. In an effort to move us along today, I just kept it to brief introductions, but know that these are greatly esteemed colleagues that are going to share some really amazing insights for us. So before I begin, affordability continues to be top and center for most Americans that have insurance, continues to dig into the pockets year over year at an alarming rate. And on that topic of specialty pharmaceutical or specialty drugs is one critical area. And I know every time as a health insurer, we're responsible for making sure that we can drive affordability. But I would love to turn the first question to Kate, just to give us a general overview of what are biosimilars and why are they, I've always studied generics, how are they different and why is it very important as we talk about driving affordability?
Sure. Thanks, Sam, and thanks for having me today. So biosimilars, it's created a lot of confusion for a lot of people. Philosophically, it's the same thing as a generic. The whole purpose of a biosimilar is to create market competition for these expensive specialty products. They're different than generics because they are biologics, and that's where the complexity comes in. A biologic is created in a living organism. It's a complex structured molecule, such as an antibody, for example. And so there's a lot of variability in these products themselves, which is why they're called biosimilars rather than bioidenticals or something like that, because the very nature of it being a biologic means it cannot be copied identically, but it doesn't matter. The definition of a biosimilar is that there is no clinically meaningful difference in safety, effectiveness, potency, et cetera. And so that's where some of the confusion comes in. But again, the point is to create a market competition environment to ultimately lower prices for health plans and patients alike.
Thanks so much, Kate. One thing to highlight, and this I found very fascinating, even looking at our data and looking at national data. And so David would love to point this to you. If you look at the percent of prescriptions that biological drugs constitute, it's about 1%. but when you look at the cost implications, is over half. So most of us are thinking, biosimilars could be the path to address rising costs. Just would love to get your take. It's like, what promise does it actually hold when you think about kind of what you've seen and where we're headed, the implications of biosimilars?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. And again, also thanks for having me this morning. Biosimilars are an important tool in our tool chest to help offset some of the increase in costs. If we think about drug spend nationally, we are $500 billion of drug expense nationally. And as you mentioned, because of the importance of generic drugs historically, those are now reaching 9 out of every 10 of prescriptions dispensed are generics. And that's been critical in holding down what could have been a much higher and steeper cost increase by introducing competition to the system and driving down those costs. But as noted, biologics, because of their complexity and the regulatory pathways really not being defined until 2010 with the act bringing the pathway forward, we haven't been able to tap into that. And over the last 20 to 30 years, biologics have had huge uptakes. Now, as you mentioned, it's a small population, but the cost per claim, cost per drug is substantially higher. And that has turned it upside down where we have, again, 60% of our costs are in these, or 60% of these costs are in these high cost drugs. So having that pathway, introducing competition into the market is critical for us to offset that drug spend increase. Expected to increase another 4 to 6% in 2022. We've got to have these offsets, and biosimilars provide us with that pathway to leverage that traditional concept of introducing competition into this really complicated but important area of healthcare.
Awesome. David, thanks for that. And I encourage everyone, please go in and submit any questions so you can hear from our panelists here today. So Lee, one of the things that I struggle with is I've done some work in my past around the biosimilar adoptions. And when you look at it, is if you compare our European counterparts, right, like they've been able to see a lot of success in adoption. But when you look at, in contrast to the US, we're making progress, but there's kind of a distance between where they are and where we are. Just want to get your take on, what are some of the drivers in your view that are leading to some of this, gap, and what could we do to think of ways to be able to close that gap?
Thanks, Emmett, and thank you for having me. I think the first thing to point out is that Europe kind of has a head start on biosimilars. The US was only granted the authority to approve biosimilars in 2010 as part of the Affordable Care Act. And the first biosimilar wasn't approved until 2015. In comparison, Europe had its biosimilar approval pathway as of 2003, and it approved its first products in 2006. So they're kind of ahead of the game when it comes to having these products on the market and improving kind of familiarity with them. The other thing Europe has started to do is kind of refine the science around how you approve biosimilars. So they've been able to find ways to kind of increase the ability of them to approve more quickly. I think they're not compromising on safety and efficacy, but they are finding ways to maybe limit the number of studies that are required. And there are also some differences in terms of their healthcare coverage. Europe regularly switches people between biosimilars and biologics with no reported adverse outcomes, I should point out. And so they have a lot more a lot stronger ability to switch a lot of people in a relatively short period of time. So there are a lot of different things that are happening in Europe that have allowed them to really allow these products to penetrate a lot faster. And again, they're getting them to the market faster. And both of those have an impact, especially when we're kind of behind from having biosimilars in the first place.
Awesome. No, thanks for that piece and insight around kind of the 7 to 8 years head start, right? You think of Europe having here, which means there's only opportunity for us to continue to drive better affordability. But with that comes the challenge, right? Because you mentioned it, this has to go to some form of a regulatory environment. If you think about the considerations we have in the US, we know manufacturers, I just saw recently in California, an employer group trying to put a proposition on a ballot, and they spent, call it $8 to $10 million. and the drug companies, spend 10 times as much trying to counter some of that. So we know, drug and pharmaceutical companies have, their vehicles to be able to drive increased profitability, navigating the patent system, and so forth. So just want to get a take from you, Kate, or and Lee, actually. What can policy makers and regulators, do in our environment to improve adoption? And I'll start with you, Kate, and Lee, if you would feel free to add to it.
Sure. This is a challenge with any new product, biosimilars included in that picture. That we are in a capitalist economy in the United States, which is unique from a lot of other healthcare models, especially. And so some of these there are these barriers that are kind of built into our system that allow for companies to compete in the way that they're doing. But it does have a little bit of a chilling effect on the availability of biosimilars. So I think there are organizations such as the FDA are already making some strides in that direction. In some of the legislation that we've seen coming out is very much in favor of supporting biosimilars and biosimilar access and biosimilar proliferation and development. So I'm hoping that will help, at least on a national kind of legislative level.
Right.
But the rest of it becomes a little bit tricky because we allow this free market competition in our system, and then that ends up impacting the availability and the accessibility of biosimilars.
And just to add to that, I think one thing that FDA is already focusing on is trying to find ways to kind of streamline its biosimilar approval processes. And I think that's going to be really important. Again, as the science is evolving, we don't want to set anything in place that kind of freezes us when things are advancing so quickly. And so I think that's a really important step for FDA to be taking, and they've acknowledged that they're doing that. And I think that will help, because anything we can do to really safely lower or remove those unnecessary barriers to approving those products is something that we want to do, because that, of course, is what we need to get these products on the market and help improve the affordability of them. You mentioned patents, and that is definitely a hot topic at the moment. There's been a lot of research out there showing that a lot of drug companies are really patenting in a way that some people have described as abusive. You could see hundreds of patents on a single product. You can see patents for what are effectively a tweak to a product. So I don't know, this is a silly example, but going from red to blue and a pill. So you see kind of these patents, and what they effectively do is increase the monopoly protection period for those products. And as long as those protections exist, biosimilars cannot enter the market. So to the extent that those types of abusive behaviors are occurring, that is something that we're certainly paying attention to, and Congress is paying attention to, again, to try to make sure that those more affordable products can get to the market as soon as possible.
Thanks so much, Lee. I'll pivot a little bit to, and I've seen some questions come through around, okay, we know we have to work on the front end, and I'll come to that part around it, kind of the whole regulatory approval process. But we've had some success in terms of drugs that have made it past approval. And so, David, want to pivot a little bit to you, because I've seen really great articles coming out of, regions and what we're doing and driving, and how we're driving affordability for our members with some of the savings recently. So great work to you and the team to continue to push it, because I think this is an area where we're doing really well. While there's more to do, I think we are increasing kind of the focus when you think about driving affordability for our members. But just want to get your take, because if I look at myself or anyone out there who has to consume a biosimilar, the prescriber has power, right? So the pen sits with the provider. And so how are you thinking, or how do you actually think, once these drugs have been made available, that from an insurer standpoint, what we do, but also what your counterparts at the hospital systems, right? So providers need to do on their part to be able to increase uptake. Any thoughts around that, and kind of maybe some live examples of how you've been able to work to drive success in other parts, and what are challenges that you see in other areas that, we have to collectively work together to be able to increase adoption?
Yeah, so at Regence, we put a really big focus on adoption of biosimilars, and we really started several years ago as we saw the first biosimilars being approved in the filgrastim G-CSF space, and started to provide that education to our providers and members. So that's the key first step, is ensuring that there's a lot of stigma out there, or concerns. We saw that even with the original generics, back 20, 30, 40 years ago. And given the complexity of these conditions, you increase that concern potentially by consumers out there and providers. So we started with education, making sure that we had information out there available, accessible, to be able to talk about what biosimilars are, what they aren't, and try to dispel some of the myths and concerns. Once we had then targeted options within some of these therapeutic categories, then it was beginning to think about the processes to do a few things. One is make it easy, the pathway easy to get our preferred products. So how could we looked at each of the categories, each of the strategies, and eliminated, mitigated the obstacles, things like prior authorizations and other steps that are in place that insurers put in place to drive products. We made it easy for providers to move to the biosimilars to facilitate that adoption. And we did that early, allowed early switches. And combined with that was communication plans. So we were out in front of the providers early, at least 90 days, 120 days in advance, talking through what products that we were going to prefer. We worked with the manufacturers to make sure we had the right net cost position, that they could supply the market adequately to meet the market share needs. We didn't want any sort of shortages or difficulties in distribution wholesalers in accessing the product. And then we worked through live conversations with our key providers using our data as a foundation. Who is prescribing these? Where might we have sensitive categories of patients that there might be more concern around switches? And then really, once we had that in place, it was pushing to go live with all those communications in place. And so, average nationally, you see biosimilars are in the, depending on the category, anywhere from 30% uptake to up to 80% in some of the products that are previously earlier launched. And we were successful in seeing 90% adoption in our preferred biosimilar products across all of our categories within 30 to 60 days, with very limited pushback or concerns raised from providers or members. Probably the biggest challenge we're seeing now is that biosimilars are seeing success, and what that's doing is driving down one of the key benchmark pricing that most providers, when it's a provider administered biosimilar, called the average sales price. We're seeing, because of that competition, those prices drop pretty significantly in some of the categories. And so that does create challenges where providers reimbursement comes into play. And so we're looking at making sure that we provide the right incentives to providers to maintain those margins where possible.
No, thanks, David. That seems like a lot of great work, but also highlights kind of the diligence you need to follow through, right? It's not just making it available, but actually driving the behavior change, both from the member side and also the provider side, to include the need for kind of increased adoption. One thing I've seen come through the chat here is, while we know penetration is still not high, I think one of our folks on the Q&A said, in what class of drugs actually is it most important that we ensure to have some biosimilar competition, right? Are there any emerging categories that you have in mind? Would love to hear from, Kate and then Lee and actually David, all three of you, to see what are some of the emerging focus areas I said, hey, we actually need to get some biosimilar competition in the next few years.
My first reaction to that question is all of them. To support biosimilars in all of the drug categories, because it's really important for us as a healthcare system to have a robust biosimilars market. we see the impact that generics have, and the idea is that biosimilars would go in that same way. I think of interest, though, there's quite a rich pipeline of biosimilar products currently in development now in various stages. And we're anticipating fairly soon some biosimilars to some of the multiple sclerosis drugs that are quite expensive. Some of these products, when they first came out, they were shocking in terms of how expensive they were. Now it's just, a normal price, but they're very expensive. And so I think there's going to be some very interesting opportunities there coming up in the next couple of years that I think we really need to pay attention to. And then the biggest, most imminent one, in my opinion, is the Humira biosimilars, all the adalimumabs. There's going to be kind of a jailbreak of adalimumab products coming out in 2023, where there's, I think, 9 adalimumabs all of a sudden. So I think it's important that every stakeholder throughout the healthcare continuum is using those products to support the biosimilar market.
And I would echo Kate in saying all of them. A lot of people aren't aware exactly how many biologics are out there. A lot of people tend to think they're kind of this futuristic product. And the reality is we're kind of surrounded and people just don't recognize it. So the one thing I like to point out is under Medicare Part B as in boy, which covers physician administered services, all top 10 spend drugs under that part of the program are biologics and have been for years. So they're already here, and we definitely need that competition because they're spending billions of dollars per year on them. I think the other important thing to keep in mind is there is kind of, we had this, close to a decade ago, but kind of a patent cliff. I saw someone say that close to 55 blockbuster biologics, meaning they have more than $1 billion in sales per year, are going to come off patent by the end of this decade. And those are the products that obviously a lot of people are using. They're obviously probably pretty expensive. And we want to see that price competition because that's going to help the patients. It's going to help their affordability. It's going to help bring their costs down. It's going to help bring overall costs down. So it's really important for all biosimilars to be getting to the market because people are facing some really high costs.
Thanks. David?
Yeah, agreed with that. I with both what Kate and Lee said. There are definitely those categories. If you look at categories by spend, autoimmune, oncology, multiple sclerosis, all of those are critical for us. One category not mentioned that's of interest is insulin, right? That's got a lot of focus by the federal government, rightfully so, as well as it's a real issue for members. And talk about drugs that have been off patent for years without a lot of competition and some really challenging price dynamics. So we're starting to see those biosimilars come into that market and disrupt that market as well. So agree that all of them, I mean, we're tied to the patent expiration dates, all those types of things. So wishful, all of them would be the wish, but those categories are the key drivers of spend.
Fantastic. No, and I think that's something we should continue to advocate for to make sure that we can increase the pipeline and also adoption. Lee, want to point to you, I know, you spend time with AARP, primarily focused on fighting for folks, over 50, their individuals, families at local, state, you name it, to drive important issues, and affordability being one. Just kind of would love to get your take on some of, are there challenges you've seen from the member side? Because when I think about it, they're all stakeholders in the ecosystems. Insurers have to do our part, providers have to do their part, regulators have to do their part, and members have to do their part. So just as you think about kind of the members you fight for and what you're trying to put forward, what are some of the challenges that you're seeing from members that, other stakeholders, whether it be regulators, insurers, or providers, need to take into account? Because I think context matters for every stakeholder group when you think through kind of specialty drug, which, as a percent of spend, the older you become, it's a higher part of kind of what you're responsible for.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a huge issue for AARP, and it's a very big part of the reason we just came off of a 3-year-long campaign that was focused on trying to bring down prescription drug prices and costs that culminated in the Inflation Reduction Act. And the reason we're so engaged is that we are very well aware that older Americans use more prescription drugs than any other segment of the population. Their median income is just around $30,000 per year. And Medicare coverage at times can expose them to tens of thousands of dollars in costs. which is just not sustainable for anyone, but even more so if you're on a fixed income. So the idea of making sure that prescription drugs that people need are affordable is incredibly, incredibly important to us. And that is why we've been engaged on biosimilars and frankly, all prescription drug related issues. We want to make sure people have access to the drugs that they need and are not having to make those hard trade-offs, because we have heard from members who have been facing the prospect of either paying for the drugs that they need or not paying their rent and not paying for food. And that's just not something that we think that anyone should be forced to do. So again, ensuring the affordability of prescription drugs is a very big issue for our members, and we do hear from them a lot. More specific to biosimilars, I do think that when it comes to patients, one really important aspect of this is going to be education, and we've kind of touched on that a little bit. Patient awareness, consumer awareness of biologics and biosimilars is remarkably low still. When I'm usually talking about this, I kind of back into it by just explaining what a biologic is before I even get into biosimilars. And so I do think there does need to be a lot of education for patients to be able to engage. We certainly have patients now who are asking for the generic, but I don't know nearly as many who would be going into their doctor and asking for the biosimilar. They need to know that they exist. They need to know they're safe and effective, and we're not quite there yet. So I think a big part of uptake is going to be educating patients and providers. But from a consumer perspective, we need to do our part to make sure that patients are aware of these products and their value and the savings that are associated with them.
Awesome. No, thanks for all the great work there, because I do think it's an important stakeholder in making sure we can advocate. David, one stakeholder I really haven't talked about is, I call them the middle person, PBMs. And I know there are a few that we have just driving, whether it's Prime Therapeutics, whether it's CVS, and others, right? So just trying to get a sense of, if you look at the ecosystem, what role do PBMs actually have to play or can play to increase adoption when you think about biosimilars?
Yeah, so there's a lot of variability in PBM models with relationships with payers. So there's a lot of variability, so not a one size fits all. But PBMs, generally speaking, have less of a role in those provider administered drugs, for which we call medical benefit drugs a lot of times. Now, they may have a key role in negotiating with the manufacturers, helping provide some of that education, maybe some of the utilization management programs. But Kate mentioned the forthcoming adalimumab biosimilars. Those are self-administered drugs that are typically under a pharmacy benefit coverage. And in that space, PBMs play a major role, certainly with negotiating with the manufacturers, finding the lowest net cost option, adjudicating those claims, holding the network contracts with the pharmacies, which help to define the reimbursement. Most of these, of course, by nature, will be going through specialty pharmacies. And that's a critical player in this mix too, oftentimes owned by the PBMs, but could be separate, and making sure that the specialty pharmacies are fully engaged in helping to switch those members, provide some of that education, ensuring that cost share and copay assistance programs, things like that, are transitioned appropriately to help protect member cost shares and those types of things. So certainly on the pharmacy benefit side, PBMs play a critical role, and they help oftentimes support the provider administered drugs as well.
Awesome. No, thanks for the education around where, medical and pharmacy generally sit, and what segment do we at times see biosimilars. But again, good to be seeing that there'll be increased pipelines on self-administered that could where they could have an increased role. No, so thanks again, David, for that. I want to shift us back to where we started on policy, right? Because I think it keeps coming up against, like, what role do regulators have to play in our environment, both at the state, local, federal levels, and if you even think about CMS, right? With what they've done recently and I know, Lee, you mentioned it with the Inflation Reduction Act, right? Are we going to see things really move there? So my question, Kate, is for you around this. As you look at kind of the stakeholders in the regulatory environment, because there's so many stakeholders that the FDA has a role to play. local officials have a role to play, state legislature have a role to play. And it's like, wow, like, this is it's getting complicated pretty quickly. I want to focus more on just Food and Drug Administration. Are there particular actions you think that could be specifically taken by FDA to increase public access to biosimilars?
I think so. And I think they are starting to make some of these moves. When the BPCIA, the Biologics Price Competition Act, was enacted in 2010, basically creating this whole definition and this whole world of biosimilars for us, there were a lot of statutory provisions in there that have actually caused a lot of confusion. One of them is the naming convention that nobody understands. And, you know, there's a required, a mandatory 4-letter meaningless suffix on the end of the non-trade name. So, you know, so people are getting confused about why that is or what's important there. There's the question of interchangeability is a huge one. It's becoming a huge one. And the challenge, the confusion with that is it's simply a statutory requirement that a pharmacist cannot substitute a product without informing the provider. I'm a pharmacist and we inform the provider when we switch products anyway. So, but if it did not have this interchangeability designation, you cannot do that without prior, at least informing the provider, the prescriber. But the issue is that people are viewing this interchangeability as a better than kind of a measure, when it's really not. It just means it's still a biosimilar. So it had to go through all of the rigorous analytics to achieve that biosimilarity status. But then they have to do extra trials, extra studies, spend more money to get this interchangeability thing. And it's really only relevant when it's products that are dispensed by a pharmacist. So when we're seeing the adalimumabs coming out, that's the first time that we're really going to see the potential impact of interchangeability. And every state has different regulations and laws about interchangeability. So I think there's some opportunities for FDA, first of all, to really streamline and maybe refine what their expectations are around that. You know, interchangeability is statutory. We have to live with it, but we could figure out how to manage it better and make it less confusing. And then aligning the states, I think, would go a long way too.
And Kate, I'll stick with you on this because I just saw a question come through that says state policymakers spend considerable time passing interchangeability laws. Does this really matter, or is brand versus brand competition enough to create adequate competition?
So again, it goes back to the confusion of what interchangeability is and how they're defining it differently, and what the pharmacist's role is or what the requirements are differently. What I'm hoping, and this is my very own personal opinion and very personal crystal ball, is that when we suddenly have 9 adalimumab products available, that people will stop caring about interchangeability. There are, and that some of them do have the interchangeability designation. But I think in terms of competition, the interchangeability piece is actually something of a barrier to competition, because it's adding that extra layer that people don't understand, and this extra requirement to follow, and the extra expense for the manufacturers. So I think there's a lot that could be done in terms of streamlining these things. And honestly, we're still waiting to see whether or not that's going to, how big of an impact that's going to have on the state by state level, because up until now, it's been, as David said, medical benefit drugs that really don't apply to the interchangeability designation.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for that. I'm always learning something new every day. So really appreciate this esteemed panel diving a little bit into some of the challenges that we experience, even after, right, we've approved these drugs to be made available. We still have to go through certain barriers. Leah, I want to touch on the regulatory piece, stick with that theme a little bit more. As you think about the work you do through AARP and making just kind of the push, right? When you think of the state and local, just trying to get a sense of, what are continued efforts that you think we can drive either at the state level, at our local level, or at the federal level to be able to drive increased adoption for biosimilars?
So I kind of want to build a little bit on what Kate said when it comes to those substitution laws, because that's certainly something that we have recognized that some of those state laws aren't necessarily conducive to substituting. There's creating some additional barriers. And our position has always been that the substitution process for biosimilars should be the same as it is for traditional generics, as regular chemical-based generics. And so that, I think, is definitely a place where we could play in the sense of trying to harmonize the requirements for substitution to make it as easy as possible for patients to access these lower cost products when they're available. More at the federal level, I do think that there's some work to be done when it comes to, again, kind of harmonizing FDA with the rest of the world. Europe doesn't even have an interchangeability designation. They just treat biosimilars as biosimilars, and they're all able to be substituted. And I think to the extent that the science can support that type of change is also something that could potentially be useful when it comes to speeding the availability of these products and making sure people have access to them. I think also something we've been seeing, for example, with Medicare, CMS has been, as you mentioned, in the Inflation Reduction Act, there's some changes in reimbursement that are intended to help kind of promote the use of biosimilars because of some, let's say, strangeness within how Medicare reimburses providers. It could potentially incentivize them to want to prescribe a more expensive product. To the extent that those can help nudge prescribers toward using those products, I think that's incredibly important too. And I think also going back to FDA, going back to that education, I think that is going to be incredibly important both for patients and for providers, because the reality is providers are the ones who are prescribing these products. And we want to make sure that they are comfortable with them. And I do think that's going to take a lot of work. Going back to Europe, they've had a very comprehensive education campaign when it comes to biosimilars. And I think that sort of thing could be very useful here, just to make sure that all of the players are up to speed on the science, the safety, making sure that they are comfortable using biosimilars as more and more of them start entering the market.
Awesome. Well, thank you. David, I want to come to you now, shifting from the policy angle a little bit, as a, health insurer, right? You've seen relatively, I'd say, better success than the average. But as you think, I'm sure that's kind of not where you want to stop. You want to continue to drive more and more. Just like if you, from your lens in the insurance side, driving affordability for our members, what are some of the unlocks that you think we need to help you either achieve your aspiration and driving increased biosimilar penetration?
Yeah, I think it comes back, we touched on it already, but that educational component is critical, and helping us translate what is that complex regulatory landscape to the providers and members and patients at the other end of it, so that they don't, things like interchangeability were put in place in some ways to create uncertainty or distrust of the biosimilars, and help to limit some of the competition concerns that were in place. That's some of the lobbying behind that concept. So again, providing that education, helping people understand why we're promoting the biosimilars. What does that do? How does it affect them personally in terms of their premiums, their cost shares, and making sure that also the providers understand and have access to these agents, and then fostering that competition so that we can have new agents come to the market, continuing to drive new innovations, and again, get to that affordability and access that all of the stakeholders really at the end of the day share, is safe, effective, affordable medication that you can achieve or obtain and get just in time when you need it. So, at the end of the day, it's really helping us as payers keep the affordability, keep the premiums low, and telling that story. So that people understand that those dollars that are coming into the system aren't being triaged off to other third parties. It's really helping them afford fundamentally their healthcare.
Awesome. No, really appreciate it and highlighting that. I know we have a couple of minutes before we wrap up. I just want to point to our Q&A to see if folks have any questions. Otherwise, I think I'll have one last go around for each of our panelists. As a reminder, I want to definitely thank our friends at the Regents Health Policy Center for making this possible first event, and I'm sure they have more in stock in terms of advancing key policy issues that we believe can drive affordability, accessibility, and better outcomes for our members and communities writ large. And I'm just going through here. I don't see any questions. I think we've addressed most of the questions here in the chat. So I'll just go one last question, go around for our panelists. You know, one thing we'd love for you to share, I know we've touched on the regulatory side, we've touched on the member side, we've touched on physicians, we've touched on PBMs, everyone in the ecosystem. But if, you know, kind of would love for you to end on a view of what is your aspiration of where you see biosimilars, call it in the next 5 to 10 years, right? Vis-a-vis now we see even new trends of gene therapies and so forth coming, because it seems like the kind of small drug molecules are not a thing of the past. They still treat many diseases. I think I've seen 2/3 of the world's disease burden can be eradicated with our current drug pipeline. So we have enough to drive it, but it seems like we're shifting, right? The new age is going to be with kind of what we're gene therapy, biologics, and so forth. So we'd just love to get kind of your view of 5 to 10 years out. How do you envision this actually playing out when you think of biosimilars, the impact it would have had to further drive new innovations that can bring affordability? And I'll start with Kate Lee and then wrap up with David.
So this is it's always an interesting topic to think about. So I really hope that we see biosimilars becoming like generics, you know, in the way that they're treated, understanding that they're scientifically different, but like I said before, philosophically the same. And so, but I think we're at a really important nexus right now to make sure that the biosimilar market stays healthy. And one important concept is, you know, I'm a researcher, and one important piece is that by supporting biosimilars, we're actually reducing some prices, but then still allowing the innovation to occur. You know, so there are many companies that are producing both biosimilars and originator biologics. And so it really ends up opening up the gates a little bit, even for healthcare. You know, if a hospital system has to pay less on their drugs, perhaps that they can have some more room to spend money on other things. So I hope that in 5 to 10 years that we are not having this conversation.
I don't know what more to say to that. I absolutely agree with what Kate just said. You know, the end goal is to have a thriving market that we can compare to what we have now with traditional generics. When, you know, a drug goes off patent, we immediately have that price competition that can bring down prices and increase affordability for patients. That really is the dream of this. And that is hopefully where we end up going throughout this process. I know that, you know, the traditional generic market had some hiccups when it first started back in the 1980s. And I think we're seeing some of the same things today. But hopefully we can get past those much the same way we did with traditional generics. And again, get to that thriving market that really is going to be so incredibly important as more of these biologics enter the market and more people are using them. We really do need those price competition for biosimilars to make sure people have access to the drugs that they need.
Yeah, agreed with both and well said. You know, I would like to see the market behave in more ways like traditional generics than what we see today. Although, you know, there are some fundamental differences, a lot of upfront costs in manufacturing facilities and things like that for the manufacturers. So I don't think it can be a complete just race to the bottom and have, you know, I'm not sure that I think we could stifle competition in the future. So what will a mature biosimilar market look like? I think it looks like a hybrid of traditional generics and brands in some way. So we've got to make the incentives for manufacturers to want to play in this space. And what does that thriving market, as it was said earlier, look like? I think will look a little different from generics. So we have to invest and make sure that we are keeping that market sustainable so that costs decrease for all. But again, I think we've got some room to move more towards traditional generics than we are today. That's what I'd like to see over the next 5 years.
Awesome. Thank you. Kate, David, Lee, really appreciate you taking the time today to share a little bit about your insights when you think about biosimilars and the impact, right, it can have in terms of affordability and accessibility for our members. And again, thanks to the Region's Health Policy Center for hosting this first virtual event. And for all those who dialed in, really thank you for a great discussion and hope to see you soon.